Today is a sad day, and this car represents the end of an era. After almost 70 years of local manufacturing, the last Holden rolls down the assembly line at Elizabeth, South Australia today.
And what a great story it's been, Shorty. And it all started with this, the FX, back in 1948. So what better time to celebrate than now and take a trip down memory lane and revisit some of the most iconic Holdens of the last 70 years. Holden has been woven into the fabric of the Australian landscape for more than a century. Even though it wasn't the first car maker in the country, it is considered our own. Born from a saddlery in Adelaide that first dabbled in the car industry as an upholsterer in the early 1900s, Holden's Motor Bodybuilders, as it was known, then started assembling cars in the 1920s before it became part of the General Motors empire in 1931. During World War II, it started to kindle the idea of creating a truly Australian car. The FX was actually introduced by none other than the Prime Minister of Australia at the time, Ben Chifley. Introduced in 1948 and featuring a 2.15 litre grey motor 6-cylinder engine in its front. This car was quite genuinely built by Australians for Australians, and it was dubbed their first Australian car. It had a 3 on the tree manual transmission, could clock over 100 miles an hour, although that seems a bit sketchy, and it had a claimed average consumption of 30 miles per gallon, or around 9.4 litres per 100 k's in our modern metric measurements. And it's amazing to look back in time over Holden's history and jump back right to the start. This thing is tiny by comparison to the Commodore today. The cabin is a 6-seater, it's got 2 bench seats, and yet it is no bigger than probably a Barina inside, but it is so gorgeous. Some of the details, the Art Deco sort of styling and the badge work and the ornamentation in here is just brilliant. The engine, it produces all of 45 kilowatts. This car immediately appealed to Australian families because it was built tough, and for its time it was relatively spacious. It was a huge hit among Aussies, and it didn't take long for Holden to develop a workhorse ute version a few years later. The FX was replaced by the iconic FJ Holden, or the Humpy. By the end of the 1950s, Holden was really hitting its strides.
1963 saw the launch of the EH. It was the 8th Holden model since 1948. Despite a new look and clever styling, new engines and features that included optional factory-fitted power steering for the very first time, the EH was the same price as the previous EJ model. It was also cheaper than Holden's from the mid-50s. This made the EH easily the best value car on the Australian market. The EH was powered by 2 versions of Holden's all-new red 6-cylinder, a 149 cubic inch and the legendary 179. Both were Holden's most powerful and fuel efficient to date. The EH became the fastest selling Australian car ever, notching up an amazing 250,000 units in 18 months. It was also the brand's first homologation special for racing, laying the foundations for the brand's performance heritage. And if you ask me, well, it's one of the most beautiful Holdens ever made. But Holden was still just warming up, and bigger things were in store over the next decade.
Well, the late 60s and into the 70s was a hugely significant time for Holden. In 1968, the HK arrived, as well as the Kingswood and this, the iconic Monaro. It's the 2-door coupe that literally spawned a muscle car war between Holden and its arch rival Ford that lasted for decades. Now, it's pretty hard to find a mint condition HQ these days, one that hasn't either been wrapped around a telegraph pole or molested with modifications. And this one has had some mild tweaks to it. It's got a fuel injected 350 Chev in the front of it, it's got a big drop tank out the back, and it's got some larger recreation of wheels, but it still oozes that 70s cool. It's a decade when plastics were starting to come in. It's where FM radio came in. You had a clock, you had bucket seats rather than bench seats. Man, this thing is cool. At the early part of the decade, there was no replacement for displacement, and Aussies couldn't get enough of the Monaro. And Holden was equally as flat out producing the HQ. It was Australia's most popular car during the 70s and one of Holden's all-time bestsellers even today. The Kingswood was so ingrained in our psyche, there was even a TV show named after it. However, things were very different in the lead up to the 1980s as pollution was starting to be a problem and an oil crisis sent petrol prices skywards.
As the oil crisis hit large car sales in the 1970s, Holden looked for a smaller, more aerodynamic alternative, and this was it, the VB Commodore. It was a major change of direction for Holden. The 18th new Holden model brought new levels of sophistication, comfort, equipment, excellent handling and performance, all in an efficient sized package. Based on the Opel Rekord from Germany, but adapted to Australian conditions, including sliding the great Aussie V8 under the bonnet, the Commodore became the foundation for the brand's success right through the 80s. While the Commodore's always been viewed as a large car, it's easy to forget just how small these earlier Commodores actually were. They really weren't large cars. But over the course of the decade, it quickly became an Australian icon. Brocky used Commodores to win the Repco Round Australia trial, the Australian Touring Car Championship, and win Bathurst 5 times. Brock also used Commodores to start his HDT performance road car business. But in 1987, he fell out with the company over his infamous energy polarizer. But that wasn't the last we would see of official Hot Rod Holdens.
The 1990s was an equally tumultuous period. Australia was in a recession, grungy teenagers were angry at the world, and Japanese cars were starting to really hit their mark. The battle between Holden and Ford, though, was as fierce as it has ever been, and burnouts, bragging rights and Bathurst wins were still as important as ever. It also marked a significant revival in muscle cars. After the acrimonious split of Peter Brock and HDT, this was born, Holden Special Vehicles, and with it the VL, Group A Walkinshaw, and this, the Group A SS, from the VN model onwards. The VN Commodore was a return to a full large car for Holden. Like the VB to VK series, it was still based on a European Opel-sourced product, but Holden stretched it in almost every dimension to suit our big country demands. It also introduced a V6 engine for the first time. This was the last homologation special required under the Group A rules for the Touring Car Championship. And what a beast it is. 5 litres of fuel-injected V8 under its bonnet, big wings, even cutouts in the side skirts for the exhausts of the racing car. You can immediately feel that big car sensation. There is a heap of space in this thing and great vision through all of the glass. Despite that massive wing on the back, you can really see out of this thing. It also brought new technologies. This thing's got climate control all the way back in the late 1980s. This is the equivalent of today's HSV GTSR W1. By the end of the 1990s, the Commodore was on a roll. It had taken over from the Falcon as the most popular car in the country, a position it would hold for almost 17 years, with popular vehicle series like the VT and VS laying the foundations for a bumper run into the new millennium.
The VT Commodore became the biggest selling Commodore of all time, with more than 300,000 units rolling off the production line. But without a doubt, the car of the decade was this one, the VE Commodore. The billion-dollar baby, as it was affectionately known. It was the first Commodore 100% designed, engineered and built here in Australia with no ties to the Opel brand. At the time, it seemed like the right move as the Commodore had a stranglehold on the top spot in the sales charts. But in 2010, its 16-year run was brought to an end by the Mazda 3 small car. And the era of the large Aussie-made car appeared to be at an end. Which is a shame, because the VE was a great car. All up, more than 500,000 were built, both for Australia as Holden and overseas where it wore the Pontiac G8, Chevrolet Lumina and Vauxhall VXR badges. Despite the declining sales of large cars, Holden had one last roll of the dice.
By the time the early noughties rolled around, the writing was on the wall for the large car being Australia's family favourite. It was in the post-GFC hangover where high petrol prices forced customers into smaller cars and more flexible SUVs. But Holden still tried to keep the Commodore alive, focusing on fuel efficiency targets, lightweight materials, and with this final VF Commodore it realised that it was going to go out with a bang. No longer was it concentrating on making the Commodore a family favourite, instead it was going to make it Australia's greatest muscle car. And in that, it has exceeded expectations hugely. This final VF lives up to that premise with absolute honour. It has so much character to it. That big 6.2 litre V8, which was exclusive to HSV before now, has got plenty of power. It sounds great. It's got these unique patented exhaust tips on it that crackles and burbles on the overrun. It's got a dynamic character about it that is stiff and taut, and the steering is nice. The seats are snug. Holden basically put all of its resources into making these SS and SSV versions, the flagship performance cars, the absolute best they could be. And there is no doubt the Aussie muscle car has ever been better than today. And with that, it is a shame that the Australian car industry is no longer as commercially viable as it could, because this is the best Australian car that has ever been created. Well, Shorty, there's certainly been some awesome Holdens over the last 70 years, hasn't there?
Absolutely, mate. And look, we've really only scratched the surface with all the great cars that Holden have made, but it has proven that Holden have always made great Australian cars for Australians.
Absolutely, Shorty. We've had Bathurst winners, we've had the birth of the V8 muscle car, and some great family cars in between. But the future looks a lot different from here on out.
Oh, definitely. The end of the Australian car industry is a momentous occasion. And there's no doubts that the closure of Holden, well, that's going to pull on the heartstrings of many Aussies for years to come.
One of those is you, right?
Including me.